The phone rings before dawn, the kind of ring that sounds louder because the city is still half asleep. In a small office where fluorescent light turns everything the color of paper, a clerk reaches for the receiver with the same motion he used yesterday, and the day before that. His coffee is already cold. Beside it, a stack of petitions, names, dates, signatures, each one an attempt to force the state to admit a simple fact. My son was taken. My daughter never came home. Tell me where they are. The clerk doesn't look up when he stamps the top page. He doesn't have to. The stamp lands like a period at the end of a sentence that no one will read. Outside, Buenos Aires is learning a new grammar. Doors open only after a long pause. Conversations shrink to whispers. People begin to notice the same detail in different neighborhoods. A car that doesn't belong, idling too quietly. Men who don't wear uniforms, but move like they do. A glance that lingers on a face a second too long, as if memorizing it for later. Argentina's descent into this fear didn't happen in one night. It leaked in, year by year, through the cracks of the early 1970s. Economic shock, political violence, the sense that the country was being pulled apart by forces no one could control. Left-wing guerrilla groups like the Montoneros and the ERP stage kidnappings and attacks. Right-wing death squads answered with their own list of targets. Inflation climbed, strikes multiplied, politics stopped being debate and started looking like a hunt. In that chaos, Argentina's armed forces convinced themselves they weren't just guardians of borders. They were guardians of a way of life. And when soldiers start believing they are the last wall between civilization and subversion, the battlefield doesn't stay out in the open. It moves into classrooms, workplaces, churches, and living rooms. The enemy becomes a category that can fit almost anyone, as long as someone with authority says so. On March 24th, 1976, the wall finally moved. Tanks rolled into the capital, while the rest of the country woke up to radios speaking in a new voice. Telephone exchanges were seized. The elected government was gone. In its place, a military junta led by General Jorge Rafael Videla announced a project with a clean administrative name, the National Reorganization Process. Reorganization sounds like filing cabinets. It sounds like order. It did not mean order in the way ordinary people hoped for it. Safety, predictability, a return to normal life. It meant something sharper. Congress was dissolved. Parties were banned. Unions were suppressed. The press was muzzled. The regime promised Western and Christian values, and behind that promise sat a doctrine even more important. The idea that the real threat was internal, hiding in plain sight, spreading like an infection. If you accept that premise, the next step becomes terrifyingly logical. You don't fight an infection with courts. You cleanse. At first, the disappearances felt like rumor, because rumor was safer than certainty. A student doesn't show up. A teacher vanishes. A union organizer misses a meeting. A journalist stops answering calls. Someone says they were taken from a bus stop. Someone else says it happened in a hospital corridor. Someone else swears it was a classroom. Then the rumors begin to share the same details. A late-night knock, a hood, hands bound, a car, often an unmarked Ford Falcon, swallowing a person into the dark. The Falcon becomes a moving symbol, ordinary metal turned into a threat. A vehicle you've seen 1,000 times becomes the last thing someone sees in daylight. The regime denied everything. That denial wasn't a side effect of secrecy. It was the point. Because here is the question the clerk in that fluorescent office never asks out loud. The question that hangs over every stamped petition like smoke. If the junta wanted to destroy its enemies, why not arrest them publicly? Why not try them, execute them, display the victory? Why choose a method that creates no body, no grave, no official crime scene, only absence? The answer is hidden in what absence does to a society. A public execution creates a martyr. A trial creates a record. A prison creates a place where families can stand outside a gate and say, "He is inside. She is alive." That is where you are keeping her. But a disappearance creates nothing solid enough to resist. It turns grief into a question that can't be closed. It forces families to live in a corridor between hope and mourning, never allowed to finish either one. It teaches neighbors to avert their eyes, because looking too closely might invite the same blank space into their own homes. In a war like this, The regime doesn't just target bodies, it targets relationships. And it builds a machine to do it. Across the country, a hidden network of detention and interrogation centers takes shape. Some are obvious in hindsight, but impossible to prove in the moment. Buildings with guarded entrances, basements with new locks, places where people go in and do not come out. One of the most infamous sites behind an ordinary name, the Navy Mechanics School, ESME, in Buenos Aires. A school, a place meant to train, a place meant to produce professionals. It becomes something else, a factory of silence. Inside this machine, the state is not a single face. It is a chain of small actions performed by many hands. A driver following orders, an officer filling out nothing at all, a typist who never types the names, a judge who files habeas corpus petitions without response, a neighbor who closes curtains, a colleague who deletes a phone number, a priest who hesitates before speaking. No one piece of the chain feels like the whole chain. That is how it survives. And most of those taken are not armed insurgents. Many are students, teachers, journalists, union members, social workers. People whose real danger is not what they can shoot, but what they can organize, what they can persuade, what they can remember. Sometimes the accusation is as thin as a name in an address book, a meeting attended, a leaflet touched, a friendship misread. The state's message is not simply, we can punish you. It is, we can erase you. Families respond the only way they can, with paper. They file writs of habeas corpus, insisting the courts do what courts are supposed to do, force the government to produce the detainee or admit the detention. The petitions pile up. The answers do not. The silence becomes bureaucratic, stamped and shelved, stored in folders that slowly swell like a second, quieter kind of mass grave. And still, the regime insists the disappeared do not exist. This is the Cold War logic at its most intimate. On the global stage, superpowers talk about spheres of influence and ideological containment. On the street level, that same language becomes a permission slip. Stability before rights, order before liberty, civilization before subversion. It turns police stations into front lines and neighbors into informants. It makes fear feel like policy, but policy always has an unintended consequence. Because absence, repeated enough times, stops being private. It becomes visible in the shape of a society that keeps losing people. And eventually, someone decides that silence is more dangerous than speaking. In April 1977, a small group of women begin to gather at the Plaza de Mayo, the historic square facing the presidential palace. Public assemblies are banned, so they don't gather the way protesters usually do. They walk, slowly, in circles, in a loophole made of footsteps. They wear white headscarves, simple cloth that carries a domestic memory, like diapers once did, now transformed into a public signal. I am here because someone is missing. I will not be moved into private grief. I will not be made invisible. The regime mocks them, calls them crazy, tries to shrink them back into the shadows where fear is easy. But a circle has a strange power. It is repetition. It is schedule. It is a promise you can keep even when you have nothing else left. Week after week, the mothers return. Each Thursday becomes a quiet accusation that cannot be arrested without the whole country seeing it. And that is when the junta faces a problem it did not plan for. You can erase people from records. You can deny detention. You can intimidate judges, silence newspapers, intimidate unions, threaten priests. But how do you erase a mother who refuses to leave the light? The question is not whether the regime will respond. It will. The question, the one we will follow into the next chapter, is what happens when a state built on disappearance realizes that memory, once organized, can become its most dangerous enemy. The junta's first instinct is always the same: shrink the light. They send men to watch the plaza, they photograph faces, they trail women home, they lean on husbands, on employers, on priests, anyone who might say the right sentence to end the weekly walk. Stop. You'll make it worse. But the mothers keep coming back, and something subtle begins to happen in the crowd around them. At first, people pass by quickly, eyes forward, pretending not to notice. Then a few slow down. Then someone leaves a note. Then someone whispers a name. The dictatorship has turned Argentina into a country of missing persons. The plaza turns it into a country of spoken names. That is the regime's nightmare, not armed insurgency, but organized memory. In the fluorescent court office, the clerk watches the petitions multiply. Habeas corpus is supposed to be a lever. Pull it, and the state must produce a body or admit it has one. Under the junta, it becomes theater without an audience. Papers enter the system like prayers and exit as silence. And yet, the stack itself becomes evidence. Not in law, but in pattern. The same handwriting appears again and again. The same neighborhoods. The same ages. A map of absence begins to form, drawn by families who were never meant to compare notes. The junta understands patterns too. That's why it built a method designed to prevent them. Disappearance is not just killing. It is killing plus uncertainty, multiplied across an entire society. It forces the question, where are they, to echo forever. While the state answers with a shrug that dares you to keep asking. It makes fear feel rational, because in a world without records, anyone can be next, for reasons you will never be allowed to know. The machine that produces this uncertainty is both ordinary and monstrous. Cars, keys, clipboards, radios, shift changes, men who clock in and clock out. Inside the hidden detention centers, the regime doesn't need spectacle. It needs compliance. Interrogation becomes a tool of control, not just information. People are hooded, moved, kept off balance. The point is to break the bridge between one person and the community that might protect them. Some sites become infamous later because survivors describe them and documents surface and buildings are repurposed into museums. But in the moment, they are just addresses. You learn not to speak out loud. Ezime is one of them. A name that should mean training and professionalism, transformed into a node of the shadow state. Here is another question the regime never answers, because answering would reveal the logic. If you have to hide what you are doing, what does that say about your claim to be saving the nation? The mother's presence forces the regime to do something it hates, react in public. It cannot admit to the crime, but it can try to discredit the accusation. It can call the women liars, radicals, hysterical. It can drown them in propaganda about Western and Christian values, about subversives, about national security. But propaganda is not a substitute for a missing child, and the resistance does not stay in one form. Soon there are the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, focusing on a cruelty so precise, it sounds like an administrative procedure. Pregnant detainees held until birth. Babies taken and given new identities and families aligned with the regime. A stolen life doesn't leave the same kind of trace as a disappearance. It leaves a living contradiction, someone growing up inside a name that doesn't fit. For the grandmothers, memory becomes investigation. They collect rumors, they save photographs, they preserve scraps of handwriting. Decades later, science will join their stubbornness. DNA tests, archives, court records, turning what the junta meant as permanent erasure into a trail that can be followed. This is the dictatorship's other nightmare, time. A regime built on secrecy assumes secrecy will last. The mothers and grandmothers treat time like a weapon in the opposite direction. If you can't win today, you schedule tomorrow. If tomorrow fails, you schedule next Thursday. Meanwhile, the junta's war expands beyond Argentina's borders because fear rarely respects passports. Operation Condor is not a single headquarters with a sign on the door. It is a relationship, a regional intelligence network linking right-wing military governments across the southern cone to track exiles, trade information, and coordinate kidnappings and assassinations across borders. The message is simple: leaving the country will not save you. It's a chilling idea. Geography erased by ideology, and outside observers, foreign diplomats, intelligence services, human rights organizations begin to see the outlines of that network. Declassified documents will later show that U.S. officials were aware of Condor as it developed, watching allies pursue opponents without regard for law or borders. Knowledge does not always become intervention. Sometimes it becomes a footnote in a cable, a phrase like concern balanced against a word like stability. Here's the Cold War contradiction in its cleanest form. A government condemned in private for its methods can still be treated in public as a useful partner against a shared enemy. But the junta is fighting another war at the same time. and it is one it cannot abduct its way out of: the economy. José Alfredo Martínez de Hoz, the economy minister, pushes liberalization, deregulated finance, opened imports, restrained unions, and a reorientation that favors capital over labor. On paper, it sounds like modernization. In practice, it requires breaking the very organizations that can resist it: unions, student groups, activists, newspapers. Repression is not merely parallel to the economic project. It is the condition that makes it possible. This is how the dictatorship sells itself. We are restoring order so Argentina can function again. And for a brief moment, some people want to believe it, want the country to stop shaking, want the violence to end. But the violence doesn't end. It changes shape. It becomes quieter, more procedural, more confident. And as the years pass, the junta discovers that terror cannot create legitimacy. Only silence. Silence is not loyalty. Silence is alone, and interest accumulates. By the early 1980s, cracks widen, debt grows, inflation returns, unemployment rises. Within the armed forces, rivalries sharpen: Army versus Navy, hardliners versus moderates, factions jostling for credit and control. The machine that erased so many names begins to grind against itself. That is when the regime reaches for the oldest shortcut to unity: nationalism. If you cannot win love, you can try to win applause. In December 1981, General Leopoldo Galtieri rises to power with a promise of resolution. He looks out at the discontent, the economic strain, the moral isolation, and he chooses a gamble that feels, to a dictatorship, almost clean. A war with a flag, a map, and an enemy overseas. The Malvinas, Falkland Islands, have been disputed for generations, a wound that can be reopened on command. In the junta's calculus, an invasion could deliver what secret prisons never could: a surge of public support. A moment when people forget the disappearances long enough to chant in the plaza for something else. And for a moment, it works. Crowds gather. Even critics feel the pull of anti-colonial sentiment. The same square that held white scarves now fills with cheering voices. The dictatorship watches the scene and believes it has found the cure: drown memory in triumph. But triumph is a fragile drug, because once you step into a conventional war, you can no longer control the record the way you do in a dirty one. Battles produce bodies. Defeats produce headlines. International audiences pay attention for the wrong reasons. And enemies with modern navies do not vanish into filing cabinets. On April 2, 1982, Argentina launches Operation Rosario and lands on the islands. The junta expects hesitation from London. Instead, the world begins to move, cold, mechanical, and very real. And the question that hangs over the cheering plaza is the one the generals refuse to ask themselves: what happens to a regime built on disappearance when it is forced into a war that cannot be hidden? The war the junta chose for legitimacy turned into the kind of record it could not delete. Britain responded with speed and weight: ships, aircraft, headlines, a timeline the world could follow in real time. For weeks in 1982, Argentina was forced into a conflict with front lines, casualty lists, and international cameras. The dictatorship had spent years mastering a war without paperwork. Now, it was trapped inside one that produced paperwork everywhere. When the British retook the islands in June, the spell broke. Galtieri resigned. The plaza that had cheered began to sound different. Less like a stadium, more like a room where someone finally admits the obvious. A regime can rule by fear, but it cannot rule by embarrassment. General Reinaldo Bignone took over with a narrow mission: manage the exit. Political parties re-emerged. Newspapers tested their voices like muscles returning after a long illness. And what had been whispered behind curtains began to be said in daylight. On October 30th, 1983, Raúl Alfonsín won the election. On December 10th, democracy returned. The generals hoped for a clean handoff, an immunity pact, a sealed vault, a national agreement to move on. They didn't get it, at least not at first. Alfonsín faced the dilemma every fragile democracy inherits from dictatorship: pursue justice too hard and risk military backlash. pursue it too softly, and teach the future that terror is negotiable. His answer began with something the junta had tried to destroy: testimony. In December 1983, the new government created a truth commission, CONADEP, to collect accounts, identify patterns, and name crimes. A commission sounds bureaucratic, almost harmless. But in Argentina, it was revolutionary. It meant the state was turning toward the families and saying, "We will listen, and we will write it down." In September 1984, CONADEP delivered its report, Nunca Más, never again. Not a slogan floating in the air, but pages, names, methods, a structure of proof. The dictatorship had weaponized disappearance by cutting people out of the record. Democracy struck back by forcing them back in. Then came the step few countries had dared to attempt: trials in civilian court. In 1985, the leaders of the junta were prosecuted. Survivors spoke, families spoke, even perpetrators spoke. The courtroom became the opposite of a secret cell: public, recorded, accountable. Videla and Admiral Emilio Massera received life sentences. Others received long terms. The verdict made a statement Argentina needed the world and its own military to hear. This wasn't chaos or excess or a few bad men. It was policy. But policy leaves behind networks, and networks push back. The late 1980s brought pressure and mutiny scares. Congress passed laws that narrowed prosecutions, full stop in 1986 and due obedience in 1987, drawing legal lines that protected many lower-ranking officers. The 1990s piled on with presidential pardons. For families, it felt like being disappeared a second time, not from streets but from justice. And yet, something had changed that the junta had never understood. Once a society builds a memory culture, archives, organizations, museums, school lessons, weekly rituals, forgetting stops being the default. It becomes a choice, and choices can be fought. Human rights groups kept working. The mothers and grandmothers kept walking. Lawyers kept filing. Journalists kept digging. A new generation grew up with the argument already waiting on their tongues. If the state once erased people for order, then order without law is just a cleaner word for fear. In the 2000s, Argentina's court struck down the amnesty framework. Trials resumed. The process was slow and imperfect, but the direction mattered. The country was trying, again, to align power with accountability. This is the paradox the generals never planned for. They used disappearance to prevent martyrs, to prevent graves, to prevent proof, to prevent the very rituals that turn loss into public demand. They tried to make absence permanent. Instead, absence became a discipline. It trained mothers to turn grief into schedule, Thursday after Thursday, circle after circle. It trained grandmothers to turn love into investigation. It trained a democracy to turn testimony into institutions. Today, the white headscarves are still seen in the Plaza de Mayo. Many of the women are elderly now. Some are gone, replaced by children and grandchildren who carry photographs like documents, names like vows. Argentina's dirty war is often described as a story without endings. No bodies, no answers, no full accounting. That part is true, but it has chapters the junta never imagined. Records entered into law, stolen identities recovered, verdicts read aloud in open court, former torture sites turned into places of teaching. In the end, the dictatorship's deepest contradiction is simple. A regime that tried to erase its opponents from history ended up engraving them into it. Never again is not a mood. It is work. It is paper. It is people who refuse to leave the light.